There are bands that spend their entire career trying to find their sound. And then there are bands that find their sound early and then spend the rest of their careers trying to protect it. And then there are bands like The Cult, who seem to look at the idea of having a signature sound and decide they'd rather just keep changing. In the space of just a few years, The Cult went from a dark, atmospheric British band with strong gothic influences to a lean, hard-rocking guitar band, and then to a full-blown arena rock powerhouse. And if you want to understand that remarkable transformation, 3 albums tell the story better than anything else: Love, Electric, and Sonic Temple. They had done good things before and after those 3, but this run was something to behold. It was amazing. At the center of it all were Ian Astbury and Billy Duffy. I think they're the only ones who've been there the whole time. Astbury had the voice and the presence. Duffy had the guitar, but these were not simply 2 musicians who just happened to end up in the same band. Their chemistry became the identity of The Cult, and eventually they would just be The Cult for a little while. Astbury could sound mysterious, almost otherworldly, while Duffy had a remarkable ability to make a guitar sound both beautiful and enormous. He was never really a guitarist who needed to demonstrate how many notes he could play. His strength was knowing which notes mattered and how they should sound, and when to let the guitar simply just kind of hang in the air. He was good like that. Before The Cult became The Cult, Ian Astbury had already been involved in the British post-punk scene for a while. He was fronting Southern Death Cult, and then Death Cult, and eventually the name just was shortened to The Cult. And the partner with Duffy began to develop into something much more distinctive. Their early music carried the darkness of the British underground. There was always something larger kind of underneath it. You could hear classic rock influences already starting to creep into the guitars. You could hear the psychedelic touches. You could hear that this was a band that might eventually become something very different from where it had started, and that didn't take very long. That transformation really came into focus with Love. Now, this was the album released in 1985. You might say it's not an alternative album, and you would be right, but it was totally a college rock album, and hear me out, because it was all over the Rolling Stone college rock charts. That's where I found it. If you only knew The Cult from their later hard rock records, Love might surprise you. It's not simply a quieter version of the band. It's not. It's a completely different musical world. It was produced by Steve Brown. It's mysterious. It's psychedelic in parts. It's unmistakably British. It has one foot in the gothic and post-punk world that The Cult came from, but the other foot is already reaching towards classic rock. And then there's the song She Sells Sanctuary. That's probably the first thing most of us had heard from them. That song may be one of the biggest examples of Billy Duffy's particular guitar genius. It doesn't simply provide chords behind the singer. It creates an atmosphere of the entire song. It shimmers and it just seems to hang there. Ian Astbury's voice gives the song its dramatic center, but Duffy's guitar is what makes the song immediately identifiable. You could remove almost everything else and still recognize that song and The Cult within seconds. And that's what makes Love so special. It doesn't feel like a band trying to fit into a particular category. It feels like a band trying to create its own environment, its own thing. There's darkness without misery, psychedelia without excess, really, and rock and roll without the normal swagger. It's a little different. The songs feel romantic and mysterious at the same time. It's an album that seems to exist somewhere between an ancient landscape and a giant concert stage that is not quite there yet. Commercially, Love gave The Cult something extremely important: momentum. They had found an audience finally. They had found a sound that was recognizably their own. I can't think of anyone else who really sounded like them. They could have simply made another album that sounded like that, but in fact, that might have been the obvious thing to do. But they didn't seem interested in doing the obvious thing. They went a little towards heavier music, the material that eventually became associated with an album they were going to call Peace, and it shows the band standing at an interesting crossroads. You can still hear the atmosphere and the psychedelia of Love, but the guitars were a little heavier and the songs were a little more direct, and the band was clearly moving towards something harder. And that's when Rick Rubin joined the fray. Rubin was coming from a very different musical background, and his approach to production was dramatically different from the atmosphere that defined Love. Rather than surrounding The Cult with layers of texture, he helped kind of expose the most powerful elements of the band. The guitar became much more prominent. The rhythm section became much more direct. The songs became leaner and much more aggressive, and that result was what came out called Electric. I remember my brother and I went to a record store in West Ashley, South Carolina. right near Charleston, bought this album and did not know what to think about it. We just knew it was awesome. It was really, and still is to this day. This is where they get interesting because Electric does not sound like a band making a minor adjustment. It sounds like a band that has clearly decided to reinvent itself. Listen to She Sells Sanctuary, and then listen to Love Removal Machine. It's almost difficult to believe that only a couple of years separate that. And then She Sells Sanctuary is hypnotic. Love Removal Machine is immediate. It's built around one of the great guitar riffs of the period. But despite the enormous change in the sound, they hadn't really lost their identity, and that is the trick. Duffy still sounded like Duffy. Astbury still sounded like himself. The song still had that same combination of different things that had always been a part of their sound, and they had not abandoned what made them unique. They'd simply discovered that those qualities could work just as well inside of a much harder rock framework. On Love, they were creating an atmosphere. On Electric, they were creating riffs. And those riffs were powerful enough to completely change the band's trajectory. Transformation also allowed the Cult to connect with a much larger rock audience, particularly in the United States. The band was no longer simply part of the British alternative and post-punk conversation. They were becoming a literal, legitimate hard rock act. I saw them on this tour open for Billy Idol, I do believe. They were the better band that night. I also saw them open for Metallica on that tour. They were the better band that night. But Electric was not the final destination. It was mainly a bridge, mostly. Because if Love represented the atmospheric side and Electric represented the stripped down side, well, Sonic Temple would bring all that together on a much larger scale. This was released in 1989. I think it's their last great album. Sonic Temple is where the Cult became an arena band, hands down. I saw them a couple times in arenas, and they put it out there. This is where producer Bob Rock entered the picture. Now, Bob Rock, I believe, before this, he produced Motley Crue. And that sounds about right if you listen to the album. Rock, he understood how to make a rock band sound like a rock band. He gave the guitars weight. He gave the drums power and made the band's biggest moments feel truly massive without completely stripping away the band's personality. And the Cult had the material to take advantage of it. Firewoman arrives with one of Billy Duffy's most recognizable guitar sounds, Edie Chow Baby. It demonstrates that they could still write something melodic and emotional. Sweet Soul Sister, Sun King, shows a band that had become completely comfortable with its hard rock identity. And that's an important distinction because Sonic Temple does not sound like the Cult experimenting with hard rock anymore. They've arrived and they know who they are. And I didn't like many hard rock bands. I liked the Cult. And they know how big they can sound. If Love is the album where they discovered their identity, and Electric is the album where it reinvents that, and Sonic Temple is the album where it turns that identity into a full-scale spectacle. The sounds changed, but the personality remained. And that's the same thing with Ian Astbury. He could have easily been overwhelmed by the transition from the gothic and the psychedelic rock into the hard rock. Nah, he just went along with it, and it always worked. And this is why I think the Cult never became just another 80s rock band. There was always something slightly strange about them, and I mean that as a compliment. There was always something mysterious, kind of under the surface. You can hear it on Love, you can hear it underneath Electric, and even when Sonic Temple becomes huge and polished, a mysterious quality is still there, I think. Love, probably the most distinctive. Electric, the most immediate. Sonic Temple may be the most complete expression of the Cult as a major rock band, but they're all really doing different jobs, each of the three. When you put these three records together, you can almost hear the band constructing itself in real time. If you listen to them back to back, it's a weird thing to do. But it's an extraordinary amount of change in a very short time, and there was risk involved. The audience that loved Love might not have wanted Electric. The people who discovered them through Electric might have thought Sonic Temple was too polished. The band could have easily lost its identity somewhere along the way. I don't think they ever lost too many fans. I think they just gathered them like a rolling stone going downhill gathering moss. But they kept the essential ingredients intact. Astbury, Duffy, great songs. That's probably the biggest reason their transformation worked. They didn't reinvent the people that made the music. They reinvented the presentation, and that distinction is pretty important, I think. Those were two musicians who had discovered something that worked and then wanted to find out what they could do with it. That's neat to me. That's particularly obvious when you compare Love and Electric. Love could have been the end of the story. It was a successful album. It had a signature song or two or three. It had an established identity. The band had a clear audience. Instead, they took a chance, a surprising chance, in changing directions. And that decision eventually led to Sonic Temple, which arguably became the biggest and most commercial album by the Cult. And there's something I love about the album Love that I just keep going back to. It feels like a discovery for me. Like I said, I found it on the college rock charts and Rolling Stone magazine. But by the time you get to Sonic Temple, I was all in. They know exactly what they're doing. The production is huge. The songs are designed for large arenas, and the band has confidence. Electric is the great transition. Love is the mystery. It is the record where you can still imagine them doing almost anything, and perhaps that's why it remains so beloved amongst all the fans. There's something incredibly exciting about hearing a band before its future has been decided. That's why, like, early REM records are so fascinating, because they could become anything, and they did eventually. You hear She Sells Sanctuary, and you can imagine where they might go, but you don't know yet. Will they become a bigger gothic band? Will they embrace psychedelia even more? Will they move into classic rock? Well, kind of all three, and it all kind of worked out on Sonic Temple. Sometimes a band's identity is the chemistry between the people that make it, and that's just all there is to it. The Cult, I think, are a perfect example. The producers changed. The production changed. The musical style changed. The size of the venues changed. The band's audience even changed, although I think it just got bigger. But put Ian Astbury behind the microphone and Billy Duffy behind the guitar, and you still have the Cult, no matter what. And maybe that's the greatest compliment you can give them. They were not afraid of changing. They were not afraid of disappointing people, and they were not afraid of becoming something different from what they'd already been. That does not always work. Sometimes a band reinvents itself and the magic disappears. But with the Cult, the magic survived because the core was there. Like I said, I think they're the only two that was there the whole time, but that's really all you need, maybe. So if you had to choose one of these three records, where do you land? Are you a Love person? Drawn to the mystery and the psychedelic guitars? Are you an electric person? I'm kind of an electric person. I like the raw, direct, and riff-heavy version of the Cult that Rick Rubin helped bring to the surface. Or are you a Sonic Temple person, ready for the enormous guitars and all? You could mix and match these. Any order you put them in is going to be fine. For me, it's incredibly difficult to argue against any of them, and maybe that's the highest compliment you can give a rock band, not because they made the biggest record, not that they sold the most records, not even if they had the biggest hits, but that they made you curious. And the Cult always made me curious because I never knew what they were going to do next, and they never did anything, I don't think, afterwards better than any of these three. And when a band can take you from Love to Electric to Sonic Temple in just 4 years, that's amazing. And they make every stop along the way sound like it could be the beginning of an entirely different career. It's not just evolution. That's a band refusing to be trapped by its own success. And in rock and roll music, that's a pretty remarkable thing. And I thank them for that. Once again, thanks for checking us out. That's all I got on these three albums and the Cult in general. Make sure, leave a like, subscribe. All that stuff does help the channels. Till the next time, you guys take care.